Okay, transcendental seduction in philosophy. So, both a method and a principle, that's my claim. Transcendental seduction in philosophy is a method and a principle. Especially in relation to that issue that Immanuel Kant has raised, that Kantian issue of the subject-object relationship. But transcendental seduction is more so a decision of subjects in response to objectivity, if you like. So this is good news for philosophy or philosophers who have abandoned that idea of method, that really there is something in the Nietzschean nihilism, if you like, or that we don't really get to do with philosophy without doing metaphysics. So to conceive of philosophy as metaphysics is proper. And where there's a problem is more about our desire that philosophy is not metaphysics. But I think the tradition shows us, when we define metaphysics properly as concepts in relation to an objective world, I mean, that's as good a definition of a concept of metaphysics as any other, that our words, our concepts shall have a relation to their reference. Now, it's not that philosophy is only a linguistic kind of problem. I mean, that's part of it. But we'll move from that. But the idea that philosophy is a method, whether or not aligned with science, whether or not aligned with rationality, that's something else again. But the idea that its method is out the window, I don't think that's really a problem. It's just that you could get to the point where you have to make a decision as to what philosophy is, and it's not methodology, or it's only partly methodology. So that's why I say philosophy as transcendental seduction. Philosophy is transcendental seduction. Why it is a decision, and it's a decision by a subject, that is, a human. So it is a engagement with philosophy, and really engagement with the history of philosophy to a point such that you satisfied your own philosophy. And for me, it's the individual as promoted and valued, if you like, by Nietzsche, that's the context. So that's why Transcendental Seduction has that subtitle, Mastery of Subjectivity, or Mastery of Strategic Subjectivity, actually. So that's something that really I touched in the earlier video. But going from there, let's go from there. So the idea of method, let's put that aside. Let's bring in this idea of philosophy as decision, and the decision is the transcendental seduction. So remember that Hegel disputed Kant's kind of alignment of philosophy with science, so that philosophy should follow science. Science has been successful. But Hegel's come along and said, well, no, you don't necessarily expect that philosophy shall do what science does. And from there, we have a different kind of philosophy out of Hegel. Now that difference, the peak of the Enlightenment, if you like, is called German idealism. Importantly, gets us to this sort of crossroads with metaphysics. Now, Kant set aside metaphysics. He didn't reject it. He had a lot of time for it. And Hegel did not have a problem with that. He just did a different metaphysics. But the point for the context of this video is that Hegel went on to use metaphysics. Kant set metaphysics aside. Now, Kant brings in an alternate philosophy, if you like, and it's called Transcendental Idealism. Now, the difficulty with Hegel is it brings us back to where the original problem originates, or where the problem originates, that is, in metaphysics. Kant unravels it to a point, Hegel unravels it to a point. But with German idealism, we're back with Christian spirituality, if you like, or, if you like, universalism. So whether or not that universalism is Kantian and Christian and spiritual, like in Hegel, it's nevertheless the prejudice of universalism that we're talking about here as outcomes for philosophy. Shall philosophy only end in universalism? No, I don't think so. There's a lot more to it than that. So, as a decision, the transcendental seduction, we engage with the intention of decision in order to solve for ourselves, that is personally, the intellectual problem of subjectivity, or the subject in relation to object, the relationship of the subject to the object. So that's us in relation to the world. If you want another word, reality covers that. Or you can say, with Descartes, the mind-body problem. Now, we've got good reason to believe that there is a mind and that there is a body. And when we do that, we are engaged to a point in metaphysics. The mind-body problem, it's not quite the same as the subject-object problem. And the real advantage of the mind-body problem is that we experience a mind. Our experience every day tells us there is a mind. And we can distinguish that, especially with the way we use language, we can distinguish that mind from our body, a body, the objectivity. So mind, something special, particularly in Descartes, of its own order. That's something aside, and connected to that is this external world problem now, where Descartes kicks off the external world problem. He's toying with what's called solipsism, that, you know, the idea that the subject is the only real thing because everything else issues from it. And you get that in Kant too, because Kant is trying to work out the subjective elements of our reality. So he takes this subject-object problem very seriously. Anyway, moving on. So there's these staple philosophical problems, and they are bound up with language. So that's where we are today in the modern world. We identify all the problems that they raised in terms of the way that we use language, our practices, and so on. So we can firstly seek solutions by language to resolve these issues. So my claim is, in Transcendental Seduction, it's of that kind, that it's a linguistic solution to a linguistic problem. That's on the surface, though. The real work is what is the content we're working with, which is really the concept of subjectivity. So speaking generally about that, that's going to be the nuts and bolts of what we do. Now, I can give you linguistically an answer to something, and it can anticipate and resolve linguistic issues. But metaphysics is of such a significant order in our life that that's not quite enough. We've just got to get good at the linguistic practice. Look, especially when we get into issues of value, what a value is, what we do with values, etc., and that broader issue of nihilism that I'm touching on. So we can resolve issues by language, but they may only be linguistic issues that we've resolved. Is there other issues other than linguistic? Yes, there is, right. In doing so, we're doing metaphysics. So when we use language, we use metaphysics, we are metaphysical. But to move back to Kant and Hegel, briefly, it was Kant's endeavour to conduct an intellectual practice outside of metaphysics via this transcendental form of philosophy. And Hegel brought philosophy back into proximity with metaphysics. So the great advantage of both of these German idealisms, Kant's and Hegel's, is that we can set aside the metaphysics. So that's one thing that we can do. And we have the advantage of their philosophies. So we can, if you like Kant did explicitly, bracket metaphysics. Even though I've already said, generally, that's what we do. We do metaphysics when we practice intellectually, if you like. If we opine on a particular view of something, what we're doing typically is metaphysics. And that is because we're bringing a concept usually together with an object. So a concept, more or less subjective, object being objective. I can only speak of objective things in ordinary language, and that really does constitute metaphysics. So just following on from my notes, what I'm doing here is reading out to a point what I've written and trying speaking to them. This is not exactly right. I'd rather actually speak freely. So I might just break from this, but let's just touch on it quickly. So Hegel moves from sort of rational thought on a scientific footing, which Kant wanted, that we should proceed rationally, that we should account for the empirical, which is what science does. But Hegel's found Kant's lack of historicity. So Hegel's onto the forms, the historical forms of rational thinking. So that's profound and key in German idealism. History is probably number one. So it's Kant's lack of historicity, which is a problem for Hegel. So Kant's times, the truth concept of that time probably did lack history. So just as we have a historical component to subjectivity, we're going to have a historical component to the concepts of the time. And that's why that's why these figures in the history of philosophy, they're significant because they were at the limit of those concepts at the time. So Hegel definitely at the limit of Kantian thinking at the time and progressed it. He's saying, Kant has failed to account for history, and particularly the historical elements of rational thought. So that feeds into Hegel's philosophy, and that's a whole other thing. But importantly, while we're speaking about the history of philosophy, we do have to acknowledge that Hegel did not set aside metaphysics. So, the scientific approach, if you like, does suggest you set aside metaphysics. Kant did exactly that, but with that we have a kind of logical inroad into the mind. It's not so much the physical structure of the mind, or the brain rather, but a definite structure of the mind in which logic has a role. So when I say logic, I only really mean necessity. So in necessity at the level of both deduction and induction. So, but for Kant, that means logic at the level of deduction, and we do have in that logic a transcendental form of I suppose conclusions from argument. So they're the deductions, if you like, or the deduction. So famously at the core of Kant's key work is what's known as the Transcendental Seduction, where he does bring together the subject and the object in a fairly clear fashion. It's got its problems, but it occurs so significantly that it's history making, because it hadn't been done before in the history of rationality, I suppose. Yeah. Anyway, that's where the transcendental seduction phrase comes from. It's a correction, if you like. As I said, linguistic issue, linguistic solution. But because it's so much more than those things, we also have the benefit of what we mean by seduction anyway. So that'll be another issue. So moving on, what we do have is a new avenue, whereas with Hegel we don't necessarily have a new avenue, we have a new method, and it's the dialectical method, and it's very historical and it's very crucial. But the difficulty with Hegel is in the total philosophy is that he too, like Kant, has a desire for and chases down universalism. So that's the key idealism of that's the key feature of German idealism, is that there's this universalism, this prejudice. And so they kind of arrive at the same place. Not quite, but the nuance between them is, for the purposes here, is not so stark, but the arrival point is replete with metaphysics. Did Kant fully bracket off metaphysics? And then, for all of its benefits, Hegel's philosophy really does suffer for its metaphysics. The whole of the philosophy can be said to be in the metaphysical context. So he's certainly not the last of the metaphysicians, but his impact on the world is so significant that metaphysics, even today, shall be an issue. And remember that in the history of philosophy, what is going on is not just rational forms of thought, but the impacts that those rational forms of thought shall have on the world. And Hegel probably has had the most impact, at least in his century, the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, you've got his student Marx's influence. Okay.